Hello and welcome back to the Amoral Philosopher video blog. We're still talking about religion. This is our series of conversations on this topic. I'm here tonight with Dima Zhivov. Hello, Dima. How are you?
Doing good. Happy to be here.
Great. And so this is going to be our sort of last preliminary episode before we go into the actual arguments for or against God's existence. And by preliminary episode, I mean the kind of episode when we talk about methodology, about how you go about proving God's existence. So in our previous conversations, we talked a little bit about the burden of proof and talked about what makes a good argument and what kind of arguments there are. And tonight we're going to talk about what's called the cumulative approach to proving God's existence. So Dima, why don't you introduce that and tell us a little bit more about what the cumulative approach consists in?
Okay, yeah, that's good. So essentially, cumulative approach consists in relying on the multiple threads of evidence in answering the question, is there a God? And the reason for preferring this approach is that I don't believe that there is a single argument that constitutes anything like a proof in a technical sense or a demonstration of God's existence or non-existence. And so we are kind of left with assessment of evidence, right? That what we need to do then is just to look at evidence for and against and to try to balance them out and to see what's most likely on our total evidence. So the cumulative approach to answering the question kind of fits that, right? It fits that situation, right? That we just don't have a proof either way. That's a knockdown demonstration. And so you then therefore want to look at multiple threads at the same time and to see whether you could build a case either that a case for or against God's existence, right?
Yeah.
So that's basically what it is and the reason why I think we should prefer it. Because we kind of get a more complicated situation, right? I wish we could just demonstrate God's existence or non-existence in a single act, right? And by a single argument, but I don't think we can. So that's the motivation for this more complex approach.
Yeah, that's good. So let me clarify a couple of things. So so basically, as you say, we don't have like a knockdown argument for or against God's existence, and that gives you reason to look at different arguments and put them together to make a case either for or against God's existence.
That's right.
But then, so you've also mentioned something called proof, and you said that the arguments that we'll look for, we'll look at least the individual arguments, they cannot count as a proof for God's existence. So is the idea with the cumulative approach that when we get all these various arguments together that we'll eventually get proof, or is it the case that we'll just look at these separate pieces of evidence and as we stack them, as we add them up, we just get more evidence in support of our claim for God's existence, but we still don't get to proof in a way. Is that the case? Yeah,
that's right. So it's the latter, clearly the latter, because I think proof in philosophy in general is really hard to come by. And in fact, when we were using in earlier episodes the locution burden of proof, right? We should have, I guess, to be as clear as we can possibly be, used the phrase the burden of justification. That I think fits better because I don't think you can prove in a technical sense, arriving at certainty with respect to an existential claim like there is a God or there isn't a God, and that's fine. Like I think there's nothing wrong with that. This is just what we recognize broadly in philosophy, in science. That science doesn't deal with certainty in a technical sense, but what it deals with is preponderance of evidence or evidence of the strength that it becomes, irrational to believe otherwise, for example. So, but ultimately it is a matter of probabilities and not certainty.
Yes. So again, to link this with the discussion that we have in one of the earlier episodes, we made a distinction between different types of arguments, and we talked about deductive, inductive, and abductive arguments, or the inference to the best explanation. And so we said that the deductive arguments are these kind of arguments which has a certain form, and if the premises are true, the conclusion is necessarily true. And so I guess these arguments can be considered as a form of proof, granted the premises are true, of course. But then in the case of the arguments for God's existence that we're going to look at, is it fair to say that they are closer to being inductive arguments or maybe abductive arguments, like inferences to the best explanation, meaning that the more evidence you have on your plate, the stronger their argument becomes?
So this is an excellent question. So let's start with the deductive argument, right? Because we will be dealing with forms of arguments that are deductive. And I think the reason why I thought it would be best to use deductive form is because it's simpler to kind of follow. It makes every step very explicit and so on. But like we noted earlier, even with the deductive arguments, you don't necessarily have the certainty attached to each premise. So you're right. If we had certain premises that all parties to the question recognize as certain, then it just follows demonstrably that God exists or God doesn't exist, say. And that's the end of story. You don't actually need to keep on looking for further evidence. It would be like trying to keep on looking for evidence against the certainty that I don't know, for some mathematical truth that 1 + 1 = 2. Maybe we can look into the world and find something that disconfirms. That seems strange. But in the case of arguments for God's existence that are deductive, you just don't have that certainty attached. And therefore, you don't have certainty attached to the conclusion. So what that means is essentially the form no longer becomes relevant, because essentially you're still dealing with probabilities. And ultimately, in a cumulative case, you want somehow to use the probabilities that this deductive argument gives in a case that's bigger for the existence of God, right? This cumulative case for the existence of God. So does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So before we go into talking a little bit more about the cumulative case, maybe we could sort of look at one argument very briefly, say maybe the Kalam cosmological argument that we'll be discussing next time, and see how we can, because perhaps we can interpret it as both an inference to the best explanation and maybe some other form, and see how those different forms compare to each other. So do you want to briefly just outline what the premises and the conclusion is and see what form it?
Sure. Sounds good. So let's see which form we can use. Let's just use the standard form, right? So for example, the standard form would have it that everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's premise 1. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. And then the conclusion is the universe has a cause for its beginning to exist, right? And then what happens is that the stage 2, so to say here, is to analyze which properties this cause must have by the very nature of the case or things. So for instance, if by universe we mean that it is all physical reality, all time and space, then presumably, and we will discuss it in great detail in the next episode, you could kind of infer or deduce that the cause must itself be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful enough to bring about into existence the entire universe. And there are certain moves you can make as a theist to argue that the cause must also be personal. Right, so you arrive at that. If all goes well in the Kalam, you arrive at that conclusion, right? And that's based on the conceptual analysis of the cause that we deductively sort of arrived at, right? Given the argument. But again, the premises in that argument are not certain. So if I wanted to use this in a cumulative case for God's existence, right, I might want to sort of translate that ultimately to something like, if I wanted to bring to argue that the probability of God's existence, and we define God as that there exists a necessary personal being, which is also omnipotent, omniscient, and all good. Now, clearly, this definition has many more properties, right? Many more specific properties that are not entailed by the conceptual analysis of the cause of the beginning of the universe, right?
Yeah.
For example, just to compare omnipotence and supreme power, or to compare necessity, there is no entailment that the cause in question must be necessary if all you have is the Kalam, right? So then the question becomes, how could I use that argument in a cumulative case for God as defined? It's at this point that I might, if I were, say, I don't know, Richard Swinburne, I might want to represent some of the facts involved in the argument as, for example, I might say, the relevant piece here is that the universe began to exist, right? And I could use that in a cumulative case, right? And I could say that that has probabilistic significance for theism. It raises the probability that theism is true, right? So that's one way. Or I might think what we're dealing with here is basically the best explanation of the fact that the universe began to exist.
Right.
And that here we're straightforwardly are bringing theism because we want to claim that somehow it does well vis-a-vis the evidence as an explanation for the beginning of the universe, say.
Yeah.
And so in a way, the initial form of the argument will not matter much ultimately at the final stage of building a case, right? We might adjust it slightly depending on how we want to ultimately represent that final stage of evaluating our total evidence and multiple threads. But given that we don't have certainty anyway, the fact that the arguments are deductive to begin with just aren't all that sort of weighty or significant. We still don't get certainty.
But so to go back to the cosmological argument briefly. So as you mentioned, it has these two stages, and the first stage definitely looked like a deductive argument, and we can assess it in terms of probability if people disagree whether the universe began to exist, for instance, or it was always there. But if people grant you that and you accept the premises that everything to exist has a cause, then you necessarily get to the conclusion that the universe had a cause. But then the second step of the argument looked more like indeed an inference and best explanation, because you're trying to come up with options of what the cause could be, and the way for you to get to the conclusion that it must be God, it involves, for instance, saying that this cause must be a personal being, it must have this additional quality. And perhaps other people could come up with other explanations that don't necessarily include this personal quality, right? And so here, I guess, is it fair to say that here, perhaps more than in the first stage, the probability matters, so it becomes more sort of inductive move, or the inference to the best explanation move. And so we already have the probability at this stage, and then we will take the conclusion from this argument and fit it into the overall picture. Then it also plays its separate evidential role in that picture. So there's sort of like stages or layers in our arguments, where in nature of the stage we can assess the probability and see how likely that our conclusion is correct, is true. Is that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And unfortunately, things are a bit more complex because you have options at this point, how to represent and how to move after stage two. So for example, at stage two, I wouldn't say that what you get or what you prove or what it shows is that God, as we defined it, exists, or that that's a strict entailment. Rather, what it does show is that there is a supremely powerful, personal, immaterial, spaceless, timeless being of some sort. And in that sense, Kalam did its job, right? Strictly speaking, that's where it at this point, its job ends, right? We just arrived at this. And then the question is, okay, you're right. Later on, maybe stage three at that point will be, okay, well, so it's consistent with theism, but it's also consistent with a number of other rival hypotheses. For example, there is some kind of lesser deity that is not omnipotent, but powerful enough to bring the universe,
Yeah.
is a stinker as far as its moral nature, because Kalam is silent on the goodness of the cause. And that would also be consistent with the evidence, right, of the Kalam. And so the question on that at that point will be, all right, so which of the rivals, I guess, are best? Which of the rivals would be a better explanation or the best explanation? So that's one question we can ask, which we could represent probabilistically like this. How many and which hypotheses are probabilified or have their probability increased because of this fact that there exists a necessary being with supreme power, it's immaterial, spaceless, timeless, and so on. So, and then the claim would be, in a cumulative case, is that theism, the probability that theism is true is increased by that, but it's also the case, the probability that a number of other hypotheses rival to theism also get their probability increased.
Right.
And it's on the ultimate kind of level of looking at all of the evidence, you want to ask, not just what's the probability of theism given the Kalam, but what's the probability of theism given the Kalam, and then the moral argument, and then these other pieces of evidence. And it can turn out, and this is key, it can turn out that there is a rival hypothesis to theism that is in some way simpler and to be preferred as on this final ultimate level. If all you are looking at is the Kalam, that at this point, this rival hypothesis of a kind of lesser deity has less properties of that deity. It claims less. So in some sense, it's simpler. And let's just grant that it is a better explanation than theism, right? Still, it might turn out that both theism and this is increased by the evidence of the Kalam, but increased with varying degrees of strength. So this rival hypothesis is increased in a greater way. Its probability is increased in a greater way than is theism, right?
And so why is that? Sorry, why is that?
Well, for example, somebody might argue that because theism postulates necessity, postulates moral goodness, we could just come up with an entity that is strictly just perfectly matching the evidence of the Kalam, right? That it's powerful enough to bring the universe, but not omnipotent. It is indifferent, or it's left open whether it's good or bad as far as its moral nature, and so on, right? And maybe that hypothesis will do better than theism if all you're considering is the Kalam at this point, right? That might be so, but what wouldn't follow is that theism will be still less probable, or will still be a worse hypothesis than that particular rival hypothesis if we consider other pieces of evidence alongside Kalam, right? So if you take Kalam as one piece of evidence, but you also bring moral argument, you also bring certain consideration about people's testimonies to their religious experience, fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, you might end up with sort of a number of evidences, right? Your total evidence might be such that actually theism looks better off on that analysis, right? If you look at total evidence and not just strictly the Kalam, right? The beginning of the universe, and so on. So that's, but maybe to kind of show why that has to be, we could be more technical. I could kind of talk a bit more about evidence and how it works and probabilities, if you wish. Define what I mean by evidence.
Sure.
Whichever way you want to.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Let's go that way. Just before we go.
Please.
As another sort of clarification, is it helpful to think of these different arguments in the cumulative approach as sort of narrowing down the list of options? So first we got for instance, the cosmological argument, and when we accept the conclusion of the argument, there are several rival hypotheses that might be going equally well. And then we added an additional argument, which sort of cuts against some of those hypotheses and increases the probability of theism. And so we keep adding these additional arguments, sort of stacking them until we narrow down, well, if not completely excluding some of the other options, but just lowering their probability to the extent that the probability of theism is raised sufficiently enough so that it looks like a more promising hypothesis to explain the phenomenon. Is that a good way to look at it?
I think that's a very good way, provided we remember, like you clarified, by ruling out other hypotheses, we do not mean that there literally are just no other. So for example, we could artificially come up with an infinity of explanations for any given phenomena. But you could sort of say the live options are narrowed down, not the options. The live options are becoming narrower and narrower, and maybe you end up with something like two that are the players here, right? And then you still say on total evidence one is to be preferred.
Yeah,
that's right. But I do want to say that technically there is no possibility of completely eliminating rival explanations.
Right, you just sort of lowering their probability.
Yeah, you're just lowering, and they no longer become almost relevant at this point.
Yeah. No, I guess it's a good point to talk a little bit about evidence, and I don't know if we'll have time to also talk about sort of quantifying probabilities and see how you compare the different arguments. Yeah, maybe let's talk about this.
Let's try.
Okay.
So by evidence, I mean really anything that increases the probability that a hypothesis is true. So evidence for some hypothesis H is anything that makes the probability of H greater than it otherwise would have been had this piece of evidence not considered, right? Had it not been on the table. So I view it probabilistically, right? And even if we're dealing with certainty, you can still represent it probabilistically as one, right? Or if you're dealing with impossibilities, you can represent it as zero. The probability that a hypothesis is true is zero. In principle, probabilistic analysis of evidence allows you that. But I think the reason why this understanding of evidence as anything that increases the probability of a hypothesis is the most consistent and the best analysis in my view is because I think it matches really well with our intuitions and even our ordinary talk about evidence. So for example, we say things like, this is strong evidence that such and such, or we say things like, this is weak evidence. The moment we say strong and weak, in a way, we're dealing with probabilities. We're dealing with likelihoods, right? And probabilistic analysis of evidence gives you that. And even when you say things like, this is bad evidence, you typically mean either this is not evidence at all, because it simply does not do the job of raising probability even slightly that the hypothesis is true. Or you mean something like, it is bad because it's so weak and insignificant that it's not doing what I need it to do.
It's
for our
insufficient,
purposes.
In other words.
It's insufficient and bad in a sense that it doesn't do the job of, say, showing that the hypothesis is more likely than not, or is just probable simpliciter. And so, but I do want to sort of, I do want to say that this account of evidence, I think, is most helpful because here we can see how evidences can stack up together. So for example, we discussed earlier the court case situation, right?
Yeah.
And we said that there are multiple pieces of evidence that can together have a cumulative effect and make the conclusion probable that a particular person did a crime, right? So let's say the blood on the hands of a person does raise the probability that that person murdered some particular individual, Smith. But if that's all we have to go on, it raises it slightly. There could have been a number of other victims. There could have been a number of other scenarios that explain the blood on the hands of that individual. But if you keep adding further pieces, like that individual was seen close to the crime, that he had a grudge against Smith, and so on and so forth, eventually you could arrive at a strong inductive reason to prefer conviction.
Right.
So in that sense, when you earlier asked, I think in one of the episodes, Anton, you said, so how should we think of the success for these theistic arguments. What is it for them to be successful? And I want to say, for them to be successful, it is not necessary that they, by themselves, when considered on their own, make the conclusion that God exists probable, right? Simpliciter. As long as they significantly increase the probability. Significantly in the sense that you could have such marginal increase of probability that it's almost not worth thinking about. So for example, the fact that, if we're considering who murdered a particular individual and the piece of evidence we're thinking of is that there's some kind of incontrovertible evidence that the person was male. Well, in a way, you and I have just got an increase in probabilities that we murdered because we're male, right? And our female friends have just got disconfirmation that they murdered, right? If we add that piece of evidence to our background knowledge. But the increase is so slight. It's technically an increase, Bayesian increase, but it's really insignificant, not worth talking about. But as long as arguments for God's existence increase the probability to the point that it's at least worth talking about, not necessarily making it more likely than not that God exists by itself, but just that this is weighty, this is substantial. Just like we could distinguish in the court of law, right? In the court, well, blood on the hands is substantial. Like this is something, right? As opposed to just the mere existence of a male suspect. So then I would say it's successful to that extent. It can therefore play a role in a cumulative case for the existence of God. Now, ultimately, maybe all of these pieces will not be sufficient. Ultimately, maybe the case is a failure. In which case, maybe we will ultimately look back on that and say, sure, it was some evidence for God, but when we calculated the probabilities of all of them together, the hypothesis of theism didn't look great. That's fine. That's fine. And you can, from that retrospective, then say the argument was a failure because it didn't ultimately, in a cumulative case, do what the person advancing it wanted it to do. But I still want to say it's worth remembering, as we will talk about individual arguments, that it's not if a doubt is raised against any single premise, it's not by itself the end of a conversation, right? It's not by itself the end of the worth of that piece of data or that argument. It might still be significant later on. Yeah, what do you think about that sort of?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So I was thinking, I'm trying to make a comparison between, the argument for God's existence and the criminal case, for instance, that we talked about. And it seems like you're exactly right that if we look at the arguments on this first level, and we might find it very persuasive, but it looks like there's a lot of action going on this next level when we see the arguments work as separate pieces of evidence against each other, sort of. And then the question becomes what weight do we assign to particular arguments if they sort of contradict each other? If we have one argument for and one argument against, right? And so to use the parallel with the criminal case, right? So you might have a very good piece of evidence to the effect that someone murdered someone. You can see the blood on their hands, and then you can have a witness that say, well, I've seen them murder that man with their own bare hands. And then it looks like, we have a very strong proof that that person is a murderer. But then if we have the counter evidence, and we can say that, the person who has testified against our suspect, they in fact murdered that person themselves, and they had an interest in, accusing this person. And the only reason that the person had blood on their hands is because they were there on the scene and were trying to, do the first aid, and that's how it happened, right? And so when we look at this cumulative case, we see how the evidence that we had that seemed very strong, it starts to loosen its weight because of the weight of the other arguments. And here the question is, first, how do we assign weight? Can we quantify that? Can we say that, this evidence is worth 2 points and this evidence is worth 3 points? Can we be precise about that like that? Or is it sort of like the intuitive approach where we look at different pieces and we see, that, you know, we feel like this is a stronger and this is a weaker evidence? Well, what do you think about this?
This is an excellent point, Anton. So the first thing to say is, I think what we ultimately care about is what is the probability of, say, God's existence, right? Because that's what we're considering here. What's the probability of that hypothesis given our total evidence? And you're exactly right. The total evidence does not just include, or at least in principle, we should be open that the total evidence will have items that are confirmatory and items that are disconfirmatory for any given proposition or hypothesis we're considering. So in our case, for instance, the facts of suffering might lower the probability of God's existence, might have the same probabilistic effect, but in the other direction for the claim that God exists. And you're right, we ultimately want to weigh the strength of each piece somehow. And at this point, what do we do? Can we, first of all, so you had two questions. Do we ultimately rely on our intuitions, and what are we going to do if our, I guess, intuitions conflict? What do we do then? But another question is, okay, so the, right, I lost my track of thought. 1 second.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe you meant like, how do we, when we have sort of confirmed intuition, but we may disagree about how many points we want to assign to
thank you. I remember now. Yeah, exactly. So another question is putting a number on something. Are we in a position to do that? And when we do that, is it just purely speculative, purely subjective, or are we tracking truth? Is there truth? So this is a very complex question. So let me try briefly, without us kind of spending too much time on that, just to say, on the question of objective probability between different propositions, so conditional probability of one proposition on another, right? I do think that there is such a thing. So for example, ultimately we want to say, if you think about the way empirical science works, we ultimately want to say that the evidence really does make it extremely likely that Einstein's general theory of relativity is true. But notice there, when they make the probabilistic judgment, as all science is, it's probabilistic. When they make that judgment, they rely on, not merely on, let's say, the evidence or the relative frequency between something and something else. So let me give you an example. So suppose I have a coin, right? And the one proposition is that this coin in my hand will land heads on the next toss. And then the other piece of data is that the last 1,000 tosses of this very coin have landed heads. And then the question is, well, what's the probability that this coin will land, right? So we're essentially interested in the conditional probability of that this coin will land, given the heads, given the evidence that, I don't know, 505 of the last 1,000 tosses landed heads. And we could all agree that at this point, yeah, it seems like quite objectively the case that we're dealing with 0.505 probability from this relative frequency, right? That it will fall heads. Now, that's different from something philosophers call physical probability. Because notice that physical probability is something that, let's say, it's sort of a fact about an object, a coin, and a fact about the laws of nature. Are they deterministic or not? And maybe it is the case that actually there is a probability of 1 or 0, essentially, right? That the next coin that I will toss land either heads or tails, what have you. And that's in virtue of the deterministic system, let's say, that we are part of. But what we're interested, when we're thinking of probabilities and relations, we're interested in kind of epistemic probability or logical maybe probability at this point, which is there are two propositions. Do they have a probabilistic relation? And is that relation, is there truth to that transcends any particular person's ability to count well, attentiveness at a time of calculating, hunches, and so on? Is there such a fact? I am inclined to say that there is, but I don't think ultimately that will be an absolutely non-negotiable thing that we both have to agree on in order to mount a cumulative approach. Because ultimately, I want my interlocutor to recognize that something confirms or disconfirms, and I could work with their subjective probability assignment, which then measures the degree of confidence that they have that a particular proposition is true, given the evidence, right, that we're considering. And at this point, we might differ. We might assign numbers differently. You're right, ultimately, given our deep-seated intuitions, right? But I do think that what we're aiming at least that's in my view, what we're aiming at is trying to track as much as we can the true facts about relations, probabilistic relations between propositions. But even if such facts don't exist, you still want to answer the question for yourself: what should I do? What should I think? And you will, as your starting point, have whatever hunches, whatever intuitions to guide you, to assign whatever probability to the relation between the two, and so on, to guide you. But then you would have a conversation, and maybe in the course of a conversation, you will come to say, oh, I didn't consider this point about the hypothesis, or I didn't see the entailment of this proposition, because we're all finite reasoners. We're not perfect logical machines. So we can all learn in that way from each other. And as we do, we might come to some kind of agreement. And that agreement doesn't even have to be perfect, as long as you still will end up recognizing, oh, dang, this piece of evidence is supportive of theism to a significant degree. And I just have this intuition, ultimately, that when you add it to these other pieces, and you have some kind of intuition about the strength of those pieces too, that you say, yeah, it does look like that theism, say, is more likely than not. So how does that sound to you?
Yeah, so it seems like we can, for instance, agree that a given argument is supportive of a particular conclusion. Then we can disagree about the extent to which it leads to this conclusion because we intuitively assign sort of different weight to the arguments. And at this point, it seems that the cause of the disagreement is sort of our value judgment of assigning, of quantifying, of assigning a certain argument to a piece of evidence. Because it seems like when we have different pieces of evidence, what causes the difficulty of assigning particular fixed weight to them is that they can be so different in their nature, right? So if you have, on one hand, something as a cosmological argument, for instance, and on the other hand, you may have something like the problem of evil, for instance. So the nature of the arguments is very different. And this might be what causes the difficulty of putting them on the same scale, so to speak, seeing how they're sort of, you may even say that they're maybe incomparable, right? So, but we still want to treat them on par as having a somewhat, well, if not the equal role, but at least we want to be able to compare them against each other, which might be what causes the difficulty.
Yeah, yes, I agree with you there. Let me just say a couple of points. I guess what you're talking about is the incommensurability of different factors here. Exactly. There is no single currency to which we can reduce all of them. And so that does make it harder a judgment. But I do want to say that this is not something that's unique to our question here. This is just across the board. This is kind of standard situation. In a way, it will be also difficult to do that in a precise manner in a court situation. Like it will be hard to quantify precisely how much weight the blood on the hands have, and how to compare that to a testimony that somebody was close to the scene. So this is there. And if just to complicate things a little bit more, let me just also say that you can have such a thing as probabilistic entanglements between arguments. And this is another reason to prefer cumulative approach. It recognizes complexity because it's the single proposition that we want to evaluate. And so here's a funny connection that exists between the problem of evil argument and, for example, the fine-tuning argument or the argument from consciousness that a theist might advance. So the problem of evil relies on the facts of suffering in the world as its key premise to then say that God's existence is either, well, unlikely, right? Because we're dealing with inductive case. But who is capable of having experiences of suffering? Sentient creatures. And those creatures must have consciousness. But there is a reason to think, or so a theist might argue, that theism predicts better the emergence of consciousness in our universe than does naturalism. So suppose, for the sake of the argument, that you grant that, yeah, theism stands in a better explanatory relation to the fact of conscious agents in the universe, right? That somehow the fact that there's fine-tuning going on for the emergence of such creatures favors theism relative to what it does to naturalism. Suppose you agree that that's the case, then it's interesting because the very premise there is suffering in the world requires that there be conscious agents, which is supported by theism. So you can have this strange intermingling between pieces of evidence and arguments, and that's only to be expected in a genuine, complex investigation of whether something is true. Another thing I think worth thinking about here is we shouldn't just look at, say, an isolated, so for example, we just assign the weight to moral argument or the cosmological argument, and that's it. There is something to be said about the fact that we have multiple attestation to the truth of the hypothesis. In other words, we somehow ultimately, when we're wanting to judge on total evidence what is the case and whether this hypothesis is true or not, we want to somehow factor in the fact that we have multiple witnesses, say, right? It's equivalent to what happens in court when you have multiple independent witnesses that have seen the person close to the crime. If taken in isolation, they each will be only marginally probabilistically significant. But together, the fact that there are two independent witnesses all of a sudden might change the game substantially. But you're right, even here, we want to then ask, which intuitions are we to follow? Who is to say, how to see it? This is where just discussion is the best thing, and just keep on talking to each other and see what we can agree upon here.
Yeah, but it also seems to me that so the cumulative approach to proving God's existence is a little more complex. So it can be compared to a case where in court you have multiple witnesses, but they all testify on different points. There might be one testifying on the fact that, they saw the person in town that day. There might be another testifying on the person's character, and another testifying on how good that person is at, handling guns or whatever. And so the fact, for instance, that the cosmological argument points towards there being a cause for bringing about the existence of universe is not, for instance, sufficient to prove that there is a personal all-good being, right? And we need an additional, say, moral argument to God's existence to prove that that being is actually all good. But then that sort of raises the problem, because it seems that if we have just two arguments and the cosmological argument is not going to help us in proving that the God is all good, then we only have one witness to that effect. And so on this, although there might be this multiple arguments forming a general picture, there's like an individual battle going on within that general picture between two witnesses, as it were. One of them being sort of the moral argument, and the other being, for instance, the problem of evil. And so when we're assessing sort of the probability or the weight of these arguments, maybe we don't need to take into considerations all these other arguments, because we're looking at just this one point. Is God really good, or is God evil, for instance, right? And it seems like these other arguments they're not really helping us to determine this point. So we need to focus on to sort of zoom in and decide this particular issue without the general picture. Would it be fair to say that?
Yeah, Antoja. So I'm not sure that I kind of agree, but I might not understand what you're saying though. So I think I understand the sort of it would have been helpful if, for example, we narrow the question to, is God good or not? Then it's simple. Like Kalam just doesn't say much about that at all. It's irrelevant. But if we are already dealing with a being that has a number of properties, some of which are confirmed partly by cosmological arguments in a straightforward manner, and some of the others might be covered by other considerations, there are arguments that cover the same territory, all right. So it's not that. So that's possible. So, for example, although this creates its own complexity to talk about a priori arguments at this point, like the ontological argument, because in a way it doesn't suit very well in a cumulative inductive case, because usually the case there is from phenomena to some explanation, and the ontological argument just seems a bit odd in that kind of group. But some have still incorporated that in the case, but it would cover, for example, the moral perfection of a being in principle, right? Or, for example, an argument that Christianity is true entails that theism is true. And so any direct evidence for Christianity, for example, from the, again, just grant for the sake of argument here, that say that there is a strong reason to think that Jesus was raised from the dead. I think that vindicates his claims about himself. And so gives us great reason to think that Christianity in particular, among the other religions, is true, right? So if that's the case, you could see how you could back up the moral argument, which is a separate argument, via showing that Christianity is true through this resurrection of Jesus route, which is a historical argument,
right?
But it still gives you the entity with the perfections that the moral argument talks about. So so in that sense, once you look at all of the theistic arguments on offer, I think there will be the relevant cross sort of pairings that you wanted to have, and you were right to insist on them. But in any case, I wish it was easier. But in any case, the overall judgment is going to be that complex, and we will just we might need at each point to be like checking in with each other. Do we agree? Do we not? And interestingly, I might have a conversation with someone else, and there would be a different conversation about what the person grants, what I grant, and where we can arrive at some kind of agreement of minds.
No, that's right. I guess my point was a little more modest, saying that we do have the cumulative approach. It's just some particular issues that we can single out where not all of the arguments that we're looking at are relevant. And so if we look at list 4 to prove the quality of God's goodness, right, at least some of the arguments, such as the cosmological argument, it's not going to be relevant to that point. So it's not going to have the evidential value for it. Is it fair to say that?
See, this is where here's a cool thing. I now I understand where you're coming from, and from the probabilistic point of view that I am advancing, I think it's not fair to say that. So here's why. Even if the proposition is God is good, right? What does that proposition entail logically? That there is a God, and Kalam stands in some probabilistic relation to theism, bare theism. So there will be an indirect boost there. It's just that the boost will be to it, not to the part of the proposition that deals with goodness, but to the part of the proposition that assumes theism. If you see, right? So let me maybe at this point it could help to just kind of be a bit more technical and say this. So, and this helps with the gap problem we talked about earlier. So, okay, so we have a piece of evidence, right? And let's be as precise. Maybe I could share my screen and just quickly I'll just share my screen and whiteboard. I'm doing it for the first time, so hopefully I'll manage. Okay, this is not what I wanted to do. Let me know when you see
I can see it. I can see it.
You can see it?
Yep.
Okay. So So let P be the probability, right? So the way we could read this is that the probability of the proposition P given Q or on Q is such and such. And so here's what's important. Let H be the hypothesis that God exists. Right. And let our Q be the combination, or the two things really, the particular piece of evidence. And now we're evidence E1, let's call it. And this evidence is just evidence from the Kalam. So E2 would be the evidence from the moral argument and so on, right? So, but it plus something that philosophers call the background evidence or background knowledge. Because you always have to, like, no assignment of probability in real world happens without a network of other beliefs that we hold. Even in the court, we distinguish specific new evidence on the table, and we're dealing with all sorts of assumptions about the way the world is, right? What people with guns tend to do in general, what detectives tend to how they tend to reason about these cases in general, and so on. And let's just call it K. K would be that background evidence. So then the relevant question becomes, whether the probability of H on E1 plus K, whether it is greater than the probability of H on background knowledge alone. As long as it's greater, you have the probabilistic boost. Right. That boost may not be so strong as it's more likely than not, but it's clearly a probabilistic boost of some sort here, right? Now, here's what's interesting. Suppose we have another hypothesis, H1. And H1 would be the hypothesis that a personal, morally indifferent, like just uninterested, morally like ambiguous entity that has with enough power, not omnipotence, right? With enough power to bring the universe into being or something like that, right? And so on, exists, right? Now, it might turn out, so just for a second. Now, some theists might want to how this hypothesis might fare better. The probability of H1 on the same evidence might be higher than the probability of H, our hypothesis of theism, on the same evidence, right? And that just means that if that's what we're considering, we should rationally choose H1 to H. But here's what doesn't follow. What doesn't follow is that the probability of H on E1 plus E2 plus E3 and so on plus K, let's say, is greater than the probability with the same rival hypothesis, H1, right, on the same piece of data, total data. That just doesn't follow. Like from the first, you can go probabilistically to the second. Because it can turn out that at this point, because of the cumulative case we're dealing with here, a single hypothesis of theism becomes simpler. It explains in a more unifying way all of these different domains of data. Then does a very narrow, ad hoc maybe, explanation that does super well with Kalam. But because it's morally indifferent, you need still a ground, say, for moral good, for moral values and duties of some sort. And that this entity doesn't do at all. So it does not get any boost from the facts of objective moral values and so on. Again, I'm asking you just to grant for the sake of argument that the moral argument might be successful. Here, I just want to show how it is still probabilistically quite directly relevant whether theism is true, that Kalam is a sound argument or not. It is. because we ultimately will incorporate it into a judgment of what's likely on total evidence. And even if with respect to each piece of data, there will be a rival narrower hypothesis, not as wide as theism, that explains that piece extremely better. If you still compare that rival hypothesis on all pieces of data, it might turn out that that rival hypothesis fares way worse, because many other pieces in the cumulative case just will not help it at all. Right? Does it make sense, or is that too esoteric?
Well, so just to link it to our case, so we looked at this two different arguments. There's the moral argument for God's existence.
Should I keep sharing the screen? Or
yeah, no worries.
Okay, yeah.
So there is the moral argument for God's existence, for instance, and that's trying to prove that God is all good. And then there's the cosmological argument that's trying to prove that there's personal being, but it doesn't say anything with regard to its moral character, so to say.
Yeah.
Right? And so if we grant that, the Kalam argument is a good proof for God's existence, and then the next step becomes for us to think if God is all good, right? And so we're looking at this additional piece of evidence. So the moral argument for God's existence. And so on that argument, do you want to say that Kalam's argument has this boost in power to show that God is all good? Or does it have the equal boost in power to both hypotheses, that God is good and God is evil, for instance?
Exactly. So this is where, right. So first of all, let me just say, for the sake of the audience, Anton and I might be using the term proof here, but we are not talking about it in a certainty sense. We're talking about it, again, like justification or giving evidence, right? So Kalam proving anything just here means gives good reason to think.
Obviously, right? Yes.
Right. So, So I want to say that all of these pieces of evidence have probabilistic significance for theism, but they also have probabilistic significance for a number of rival hypotheses. I grant that. And that's just almost too trivial to grant, because we acknowledge there are always competing explanations, and the question is which one's best. You can always kind of concoct explanations to fit the data, but they would be super ad hoc, and so you'd lower the probability for them and so on, right? So we acknowledge at least the fact that no piece of evidence is evidence for just one thing alone. So let me give an example. Maybe this would help. Suppose our proposition is there is a print in the shape of a human foot on the sand. And we could ask, what does this fact show, or this proposition show? I think it shows with varying degrees of strength that the proposition that sand is shapeable is true, but it also shows with, again, some different degree of strength, the proposition that some creature walked on it. But it also shows with some different degree of strength, the proposition that a human in particular walked on it. So no piece of data will be evidence just for one thing, typically. And that's sort of, I think, taken for granted in just generally about how Bayesian evidence works and how evidence in general works, that there will be increases and boosts or disconfirmations to a number of things at the same time. In that sense, evidence is kind of, it stands in a number of relations to many other propositions, especially when we represent evidence in the propositional form. We say this proposition represents this data. And so the question is, does Kalam have that significance for theism as the proposition that God as defined, including moral goodness, exists? And I want to say, yes, it does, but it's not as strong by itself to show that theism is true. Partly because you're right. Maybe there is a rival hypothesis, right, that will not stipulate with respect to the entity that explains the data, that the entity is good or bad. In a sense, it might be seen as a simpler hypothesis, that it doesn't side one way or the other. And maybe the boost that we'll receive from the Kalam will be slightly greater or just greater. It depends. We can have a conversation about that. But the point is, there might be a rival hypothesis that's also confirmed, and that hypothesis has no moral nature written in it. In fact, the greatness of the support might just be precisely because theism has this commitment, and this hypothesis leaves it open. Still, it might turn out that ultimately, when we're looking at all of the pieces of data, E1, E2, E3, and so on, that theism emerges as a better explanation when compared to that very hypothesis that with the Kalam was favored by the evidence, say, right? So that's what I think I'm trying to show here, and how it actually works. And mathematically speaking, it's true. Like we could translate it to the court case like this, Anton. So for example, you could have and scientific theory. So you could have in the court case, E1 could be that there is Bill who says that Jones was close to the event. But suppose E2 is that, right, so we say E1 says that, right? And then you have a rival hypothesis that, let me think how best to do that, because I'm thinking on the go here, that John didn't murder, but somebody else murdered Smith. I don't know, Mark murdered Smith. It might be that when we just consider proximity to the scene, Mark might be a bit closer. I don't know, right? Mark might be a bit closer. And so Mark should be, on that evidence alone, preferred to Jones as the one who murdered Smith. But what if the next piece of evidence is having a gun in one's apartment? And Mark doesn't have it and Jones does. E1 plus E2 might prefer immediately Jones and not Mark, even if E1 clearly preferred Mark because Mark was closer. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. There might be rival hypotheses that are favored just on when you consider isolated piece of data, but ultimately they might fall out, as you said, as truly live options, as best explanations on the final analysis of one's total evidence. Does that make sense? Or
yeah, I guess my problem with that is that, not a problem, but a suggestion was that if we look at the cumulative approach in this case, it makes the analysis extremely complicated. If you have, when looking at all the issues, you're trying to keep all this evidence at all these different points in mind at the same time. So what happens in court cases and in legal proceedings is you want to separate certain points and look at them in isolation. And so in our case, it could be, for instance, that Kalam argument is a good evidence for existence of some all-powerful being, for instance. And we, for the purpose of analysis, we can grant that point and say, fine, we will take it as conclusive evidence, and we'll move to the next stage and see, well, let's see what other qualities that being has. And you're absolutely right to say that, the Kalam argument, the Kalam cosmological arguments can provide equal boost to several rival hypotheses. It can provide a boost to the hypothesis that a good God exists, and it can provide an equal boost to the hypothesis that the bad and evil God exists, right? So for the purpose of determining whether God is good or evil, to simplify our analysis, perhaps we don't need to look at the Kalam argument anymore. We can put it aside, grant the point that some kind of a being which is all-powerful exists, and just focus on the point here that is our case. What moral character does God have? Yeah. And for that point, the Kalam argument will have no evidentiary force, because it equally boosts all the variant explanations and hypotheses that we have on offer. So we can just put it aside and focus on the arguments that we have to one or the other conclusion. But I guess you don't agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that we should.
No, I actually agree. Now, so here's what I agree with. If the relative rival hypothesis is God, or the entity in question is good and the entity in question is evil, Kalam will not help to adjudicate that question. I agree completely with you. It has an equal boost probabilistically to both of them. Completely agree with you. It's just that when earlier you talked about God is good, I was not comparing it to God is evil. I was just looking at it on its own. And I was asking, is Kalam at all relevant to the proposition God is good? And if there are entailments logically to any proposition, and something favors an entailment to a proposition, it's probabilistically significant. Because some other, see, at that time I did not narrow it to just hypothesis God is good or God is evil that we're comparing, but just God is good, and there could be rival hypotheses like there is no God. Now, clearly, God is good has an entailment that God exists, and that entailment is probabilistically supported by the Kalam in however strong way. You know, we could discuss that. But I'm in agreement with you that if the rival hypotheses we're considering are narrowed to two, God is good or God is not good, Kalam is not help here. Both of them presuppose God or entail God's existence, and both are boosted, right, by the evidence from the Kalam. You're right. So I don't think on that level we disagree.
Yeah,
I just
yeah,
did not clearly see what you were doing there earlier, what your question is. And maybe to simplify it, here's a grand simplification. Maybe this would help. There is an entity that we arrive at through in a Kalam, and the entity has certain properties. But then we move to the next argument, and we acknowledge that we have another body of facts, like the existence of objective moral facts. And let's say that grounding that in some personal being that is morally perfect is the best way to go. So suppose you grant those two pieces. Then, and for simplicity's sake, we're not considering many other relevant pieces. But you just look at that, you still will want to look at all of them together at the very end, don't you? Because you want to ask which theory best explains all of the relevant data. It's just that at that point, the data will be, here is the being that is supremely powerful, but we don't know whether it's good or not. But there is data right here that there is something that has to be perfect. And theism provides a kind of unifying explanation. In one go, with postulation of one entity with the relevant properties of theism, you end up explaining both the domains, right? So as long as you don't bar that stage of the thinking about the question whether God exists or not, I'm totally with you to look at Kalam on its own, see what it can do, then move to the next, see what it can do, but then still you ultimately want to almost take it as given that we've arrived at something significant from the Kalam. We've arrived at something significant from the moral argument. And then you want to ask which wide theory, let's say theism or naturalism, does better vis-a-vis all of these separate pieces. Yeah.
All right.
That's good.
Yeah, I guess we can agree on that. And so before we move on to, I guess, introducing our next episode, do you want to mention something else with regard to the cumulative approach that we perhaps haven't touched upon yet, or any?
Yeah. Let me just think for a second about that. If there's anything. No, I think that's fine. I think if we need, maybe this would be helpful. We already mentioned that we're interested in total evidence. For example, it might turn out that the probability of God's existence, if on facts of suffering in the world alone, is very low. But that's important, but that's not ultimately what we're interested in when we're asked whether God exists or not. At that point, what we're interested in is, again, total evidence. But also I want to say, and maybe once you bring other pieces of evidence, all of a sudden, the probabilities would be changed in favor of theism. Right? So that's, again, it just follows from probability calculus in general. Like we talked about with the Norwegian Hans who go skiing, that new pieces of evidence might upset the probabilities that you initially drew from just one piece. But there is another thing that I want to mention, especially for my religious brothers and sisters, right? What we are doing here is we're looking at publicly available evidence, and we're trying to make a judgment with respect to the total publicly available evidence. And in a way, we are artificially constraining what any one individual might do with the question for himself or herself, is there a God? So suppose some individual has strong religious experience of some sort. That cannot be straightforwardly brought into the conversation we're having. Now, it can be brought, but in a third person kind of way. There are claims to experiences of such and such. Does that give us any reason to think God exists or not? That's fine. That's totally fine to use in a cumulative case. But notice, we're not here approaching it from a first person point of view, like I had an experience. This seems in an overwhelming sense to me that such and such is the case. To give just example with what would happen in a court case if we were allowing this private evidence, right? And what judgment one could rationally make on the basis of one's total evidence if we're allowing private kind of evidence too. So here's a good example. Suppose the publicly available evidence is overwhelming that that I murdered someone, right? Overwhelming. Anyone as a third person coming to it should look at it and go, of course, Dima murdered somebody. But suppose that I am standing there, hearing all this evidence, agreeing with that verdict, that it makes sense probabilistically. That's what anyone should do. But I just remember not being there and not murdering that person. So I have a memory belief with respect to not murdering that individual. It seems to me at least possible to say that the person could still be within his or her rights to prefer at that moment that memory belief to the effect that he's innocent, even if he also admits, as so far as public evidence stands, he should be convicted there and then. In other words, we recognize that warrant can come from different sources, and some of those sources may be private. And when they do, there is an interesting interplay between those private sources and rationality of believing on the basis of them, and rationality of believing on the basis of propositional, publicly available evidence. So this is another kind of twist I want to make, that in a way, I'm not going to be with you discussing my private experiences as a religious believer. I might introduce facts about religious experiences, but when I do, in this kind of project we're engaged in, they will be of the sort people claim to have such and such.
Right.
They're not going to require you to be me in order to access any fact.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to narrow down our focus in our question.
So for the purpose of our discussion, this kind of private sort of evidence, they would have a lower evidentiary value as it would have in a court case. It might have a stronger value for the person concerned, forming his own belief. But when there is a judge or a jury out there, they would assign lower evidentiary value to that than to other facts on the table. And that's sort of what we're doing here, right? And
exactly. And so far as answering that question for oneself, which is ultimately what all of us are trying to do, I don't see any reason to keep restricting answering the question to only publicly available evidence. I think this is where such notions as justification, rationality is a personal notion. That is to say, it might turn out that you are justified to believe such and such, but no one else will be justified in believing such and such. Right. But it's a possibility we shouldn't bar, but for our purposes, we're not going to be sort of talking about it in this evidential case that we're trying to see.
But still, I mean, even if you're answering that question for yourself, you'd need to take the interaction between these different kinds of evidence coming into play. And if what you have is your religious experience pointing to a certain conclusion, you should see how you want to compare that experience to the mass of other evidence that might be pointing otherwise. And that's an important value judgment to make. But that's a question that, people should be answering for themselves.
Can I just completely agree, Anton, that there might be defeaters to those private experiences, completely agree. And maybe the strong case against God's existence evidentially should be that defeater for one and a successful for whether what one had was veridical or not. I totally grant that.
Yeah, perfect. So I guess at this point, it probably remains for me to say that this was the last sort of introductory evidence episodes when we talked about the methodological issues, and now we're all very excited that next time we'll be moving on to actually considering one of the arguments for God's existence, and that's the Kalam cosmological argument in particular. So we'll talk about that next time. As always, if you have questions on any other points that we've raised in our discussion, feel free to comment or send them to us directly. And at this point, it remains for me to thank Dima for being here again tonight. I think this was excellent. I'm much looking forward to our next discussion.
It was a pleasure, man. Thank you.
Thank you, Dima, very much. And bye, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.